Right, so we are ready to UV unwrap or UV map this couch. So we've done all the optimization, removed all the gubbins that was under here, optimized that very aggressively because that's not going to be seen in game. So we need to do a couple of things before we actually do any unwrapping. And one of them is because we need access to shading properties and UV editing, but we're just going to make a TikTok format friendly or vertical friendly version of those. So shading, join area, join areas, join areas. So we're right clicking on the border and then selecting the option from the menu. Double click, rename TikTok shading, and the other one is general UV editing. So we get a couple of panels, but again, make this friendly for this format. Double click, TikTok UVs. So let's go with the horizontal split. Horizontal split. Join those. Join those. Join those. Join those. Right, so let's just save this now that we've got this layout set so that we can lock it into the file. Let's go back to the 3D view. File, save increment, because we're going to need those. Right, so first thing, as said, we've cleaned up the bottom. So what we need to do is just a little bit of prep before we unwrap, because what we can do is use our material assignments to aid with selecting parts of the mesh to be unwrapped. So that means making some adjustments to the material assignments. So selector object, edit mode, and we can use, so let's just face select, loop select, so alt click, alt shift click, shift click, and then alt click again, shift click, but we don't want this, we don't want this, and we don't want this. Because of the way the chair was constructed when it was optimized, that edge loop wraps around the back and the arm, so we just want to deselect those. We'll have to do it manually, because if we try loop selecting, it'll deselect the entire loop, which we don't want to do. Right, so that's our selection. So what we're going to do here, properties, is assign the material for the armrest to that selection. Because what we can do is, well, click the assign button, that will assign the material, but then we can use select and deselect to select areas or deselect areas of the mesh without doing complicated loop selections or shift click selections. This will select an entire group of surfaces based on the material assignments. So select, and there it's selected the armrest that had that material alongside the selection that we just made. So this section has been added to that previous selection. So now that we've got that, we can assign armrest to the entire thing. So it's changed color, indicating that it's been assigned. So we don't need to do anything to the back, that's okay. And we don't need to do anything to the seat, that's okay, except for that little corner. So click, shift click, seat. So make sure it's highlighted, assign. It's assigned. So Alt A, deselect. What we want to do here as well, so when we're UV mapping, we've got a couple of options. You can either unwrap the entire object and basically use the same image on each section, and it will have the same density, so the same amount of detail, but for areas that are not seen, that's wasteful. So what we can do is assign a material to this that we can then use to make this a separate selection or a separate UV island or section of UV that we can then scale down, decrease the image assignment to this section whilst increasing the available space then to all the other areas of the mesh that will be seen. So need to make a selection, select this bottom, so this is just shift click, like so. I'll be able to take that corner as well. So properties, materials, we need to add new material, assign that, click on new, that will populate it, and in this case we just want to rename this, so bottom, and give it a color so that we can see. So we should find deselect, that is now assigned to that. So we've got 4 materials. So this basically means, let's just save this. This basically means that we now have 4 materials that will select 4 distinct areas of the mesh, and then obviously the underneath. And that'll give us 4 main UV islands. So to this, now that we have it, we can add an image. This is why we needed the TikTok shading or the shading editor. That's our object. We're in material preview so that we can see it. And then to this, in the node editor, we're just going to add an image texture. So add texture, image texture. That'll drop a node in. So we can click drag that. Click on new. Rename this, and let's just call this couch. 512 by 512 in this particular instance. That's height and width, and then generated type. We'll just go with UV grid. New image. So there is couch, and all we need to do is connect color to base color. So click drag. What we can do now, so that's the bottom, is copy this. So select the node, node, copy, and then using the slot selector, we can click on a material, node, paste, connect that up. So that's added it to the bottom, the first one that we did. Slot back, node, paste, connect that up. Slot seat, node, paste. Let's go back to bottom because that's what we were working on. So that basically now means that we have the same image being used by all 4 sections of the mesh, aka materials, because essentially what we're going to be doing is UV unwrapping or mapping the entire couch to one image. And right now we can see that the image appears a little funky on the mesh, because if we just take a quick look at the UV map right now, so TikTok UV, select all, we can see, let's just select all A, that is the highly edited default UV that was assigned to the original cube object the couch was made from. So what we have to do is basically tidy this up so that it maps correctly to our object. And in this instance, what we can do here is use seams, UV seams, TikTok 3D. So edit mode. And what we're going to do here is use edge select. And we're going to select edges where a seam, so this is a split or separation in the UV, placed in a way that it's essentially hidden from view or obfuscated. So it's using this natural physical seam down the join between the arm and the back of the chair. We can do the same thing for the seat. So Alt Shift click, then Shift click to add these stray edges. Alt Shift, 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 Shift click, Shift click. Let's go with that one. Shift click, and then along the bottom. And we want to isolate this. So we're going to follow essentially the material assignment as our boundary. Shift click, complete that. So let's just toggle quickly into wireframe so we can see our entire selection. So that's our edge selection. What we can do now is edge, mark seam. And this will highlight the selected edges orange. So that now confirms that those are UV seams. If we just check something, toggle out of object mode. We want to be aware in this particular instance that we are mirroring this mesh. So this is the original half, and it is being procedurally mirrored, which means any editing that we do to this side of the mesh is being automatically done to the other side. So there's a point here about mirrored meshes. So when we're UV mapping, if we have a mirrored mesh, we have two options to work with this. We can either, as we just did, mark up the original side of the mesh, and then when this is made real, so when the mirrored side is made real, it'll carry over the properties that are assigned to the original to the mirrored half. But in relation to UV mapping and texturing objects, that means that this is now literally mirrored. So whatever is done to this side of the mesh is physically, literally mirrored on the other side of the mesh. We could use that as an optimization. So if we had a pattern, a leather texture, say, on this couch, that leather texture is going to appear on the mirrored side of the mesh. But because the mesh is mirrored, the texture will also appear mirrored. And as there is a seam down the center where the mirroring is occurring, it, depending on the texture, it will look obvious that the mesh is mirrored down that seam. So whilst we can use mirroring as an optimization, so essentially we just UV unwrap and texture one side of the mesh, it basically means that we are reducing the amount of texture space that's used, or the amount of textures that are used. They will be mirrored. So if we want something that's unique, that has, let's say there's text written across the front here, only half of this is going to be used because it'll be mirrored and inverted as a result. So if we want a unique texture assigned to any objects, we have to make the mirrored section real before we can go further. So although we've done this basic seam assignment, we have to decide whether we want to just stick with the mirrored side, which will duplicate and invert the image, or whether we want to make the mirror side real and then unwrap relative to the entire object. So instead of unwrapping half a mesh, we unwrap the whole mesh. So in other words, what we need to do here for that, let's drop out of object mode. Properties, modifiers, we need to make the mirrored modifier real. So more options, apply. So back to the 3D view, we should now find, let's just quickly go into wireframe, edit mode. We've now got, again, because it's made what was the original, it's made that real, so it's duplicated everything. But this now means that we can unwrap the entire section or segment and make that unique texturally. So let's just save this. But because this is a mirrored mesh, we might just want to do a couple of, so edit mode, make a couple of adjustments with this so that it's not so obvious that there was a seam here. Vertex select, just select that. Flatten that out a little bit. Same with this. That's just to make it less acute. So we want to avoid structures like this. Well, that's an over-exaggeration. We want to try and make them a bit more smooth or softer. So we can do that after the fact. Double tap G, edge slide, double tap G. Right, so unwrapping. So let's switch windows to the UV editor, select all. So this again is what we've got by default, the default cube that's been mushed up because of the editing that we did to the original cube. So all we need to do now is literally select everything, UV, unwrap. So we can do that in the 3D view, or we can do it in the UV editor. We get a few more options in the UV editor, but unwrap, unwrap. So that's what we've got. And we can see that the image is mapped more appropriately to the mesh, but so the whole process is basically to try and edit the mesh in a way that we are mapping or positioning, placing the texture over our object as evenly as possible. And we can see that because of this shape that we have in the armrest, it's created a bit of awkwardness with the mapping, the placement of the image. So what we can do here, and this again depends on the type of object that's being mapped, what we can do here, because this is this section, because of the way that this was made, what we can do here is add, so alt click, an edge loop on this front panel, edge select, let's terminate that at the underside, because again we can hide the seam in this indentation. So in this shape we can hide the seam or disguise it and place it in this valley. And what this will do is it'll help relax this distortion on this curve. So that's one of the things that we want to do when we're UV unwrapping generally, is rather than just UV mapping and placing seams willy-nilly around the mesh, what we want to try and do is try and hide them in areas that aren't necessarily going to be seen or are not obvious to the viewer. So edge, mark seam. So we've marked that. So what we can do again is select all, UV, unwrap. And we can see that that's relaxed that section. So we need to do the same thing to the other side. So alt click for the loop and then shift click for the addition. So let's just double check that's the same vertices and edges. Yes, it is. So edge, mark seam, select all. So again we can see the distortion here versus, which is this section. So that's what we have after So that's the arm and the front panel versus the before, which is this. So let's unwrap. And that tidies that up. So we've got an extension here. Where's that from? That's the front of the seat. So that hasn't carried over. Let's just double check. Deselect. Yes, it has actually. So what we've got is a slight extrusion on this larger area of the arm with this section. So select all, which is this. So we need to be careful about things like that because it can make the unwrapping process slightly awkward, because we've got a lot of space here that we could fill with something. But that is the basic UV, or the initial UV, unwrapping and assignment. So let's look at our sections. We're going to use island select. Click on an island, press the G key, just move it around. So that's the seat. That's that panel. That's that panel. That's going to be the base, which it is. That's going to be the back, which it is. And again, it's all one section. So again, if we were to draw or pattern this in a particular way, we've created essentially the space or the form for the texture and the mapping to be unique. So you could do a tear across the entire back of the chair and you wouldn't end up with a mirrored copy. And that's the arms. Right, so let's save this, because the next bit is now just editing the UV now that we have it, so that we have a more optimized layout. So this is what our UV looks like. So we'll do that in the next video.